now it's time to introduce Ed Yohnka, spokesperson for ACLU Illinois. You probably already know him because Ed seems to be everywhere all at once. For No Kings 3, I was down in Southern Illinois, and I really felt like, here I am way out on the frontiers of Illinois, but they told me Ed had already been there. They know Ed Yohnka. League of Women Voters of Illinois has benefited greatly from ACLU's protest safety training and Know Your Rights training. It's always a pleasure to partner with the ACLU. So here's Ed Yohnka.
Well, thank you, Becky, and it's really great to be here. To Orlando, they decided to put your biggest challenge in making people look good right up front. So good luck with all of that. I couldn't help but think this morning as I was driving here about the fact that, about my own relationship with the League of Women Voters in Illinois. And in my time at the ACLU, Becky was nice enough not to point out two things. Number one, I'm getting very old. And number two, I've been at this a long time. But one of the things I always think about with the League is in the dark days after 9/11, when Americans seemed so willing to give up their rights to be just a little safer, that it was really the League who stepped up and created the opportunities for us to talk to Illinois residents all across the state about those challenges. And I think about the way in which public opinion shifted on many of those issues as the result of those events in places all across the state of Illinois. And I raise that because in addition to thinking about all of this morning, one of the other things I did on my way out here today was do a call with our national office regarding the fact that Section 702 of the Patriot Act is set to expire in the coming weeks. And so Mike Johnson is going to try to ram this through the U.S. House of Representatives next week. And if you want to take action, one of the things you can do on Monday morning is call your member of Congress and urge them to oppose renewal of Section 702, because I maintain that while that law has always been dangerous to give that much personal information over to the government, it has never been more dangerous than with Donald Trump sitting in the White House. So it is time to end 702. When I was getting ready to come here today, I've been thinking about what to say. How do you talk about election integrity to a room full of people who are literally experts in election integrity? I really should rethink the invitations I accept. But one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is, the work that we're really doing together and what this is all about. And I keep thinking about a particular quote that I remember from long ago and thinking about it again in the present moment. And the quote is, "I appeal to all of you to get into this great revolution that is sweeping this nation. Get in and stay in the streets of every city, of every village, of every hamlet of this nation until the revolution of 1776 is complete." Those words were spoken by John Lewis 63 years ago this summer during the March on Washington. And in many ways, they have never been more applicable and more profound than they are today. I think about those words, as Becky mentioned, in No Kings. Think about this for a moment. On March 28th, more than 8 million people across this country participated in a No Kings event, one of 3,300 No Kings events across this country. It's always amazing to me. First of all, every single time I go, I meet someone who it's their first protest that they've ever been to. I just can't think of anything that's more affirming and more important than the fact that they bring people out for the first time. I laugh. There's a woman who lives in my building. I literally have no idea of what her name is, despite the fact that I've spoken to her for nearly a decade. I know her dog, Brody. We're very close. But she now feels like she's a veteran because she's been to 3 No Kings rallies. The first one was the first rally she'd ever been to in her life. That is what's happening out there for people. Becky talked about the fact in Effingham, Illinois, they had 200 plus people show up. Effingham, Illinois had 200 plus people show up. When I went out there in the fall before the October rally, they said, well, we're thinking about it. I said, look, it's really good just to show up. They had 50 people the first time, they had 200 this time. There is a movement that is happening across this country, and we should all be part of it. This is an uprising against the growing brand of authoritarianism that is being offered to the American people by the Trump administration. The hallmarks of this authoritarianism is something that you all know, but just to describe it, we see the masked, untrained, heavily armed agents careening through our cities and kidnapping our friends and neighbors, not to make us more safe, but to actually bring danger and terror into our communities. We see the president encroaching on the power of the purse of the Congress, trying to making it so that only Donald Trump can decide where and how and when we spend money. We see him trying to cut off and choke off programs that have served our communities all across this country for generations, including the Head Start program, the most successful pre-K program in the history of the United States. What did Donald Trump's HHS department do with Head Start? They closed regional offices that delayed payments to local programs, and they put out a list. This is classic. They put out a list of more than 20 pages of words that local programs should not use in their proposals to get additional funding. You want to know some of the words on that list? Woman, Latino, Black, community. And of course, we see, as Becky made reference to, the attacks on free speech in this country. I think there is literally nothing that more easily cements the hypocrisy and the authoritarianism of this administration than the fact that, after the tragic murder of Charlie Kirk, we were all told how we were supposed to feel. And if we deviated from that feeling, we could be punished. But Donald Trump celebrated the death of Bob Mueller online. They don't believe in free speech. They believe in their speech. And they've always seen the power of government as the power that they should use to choke that off. And of course, the quote from John Lewis that I cited, also raises, of course, the fact that when he talks about the revolution of 1776, that our country is about to mark the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of the Bill of Rights. And there is nothing more stark than that anniversary to remind us of the contrasts in our society. Donald Trump has a vision for our 250th anniversary. He wants a UFC fight on the lawn of the White House. He wants a car race around the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And of course, because it's always about grift and graft, he wants to build with, quote, private funds, a 250-foot arch that he wants named after himself. He wants spectacle. Now, for many of us, the celebration of the 250th anniversary of this country is a time to reflect on who we are, what we were intended to be, what our framers envisioned we could be in seeking a more perfect union. Never promise perfection, but promise the tools to work towards it. And so we see this contrast in the paths that we are traveling and where we're going. And of course, finally, because I was going to get there. And finally, of course, John Lewis, because of who he was and who he became and the things in the work that he did, reminds us about the importance of voting rights. And Trump's authoritarian vision, of course, now includes meddling in our midterm elections to get the outcome that he and his acolytes want. And that is the challenge that we must think about for the next several months and be prepared to fight. You know, I think it's fair to say, if one just sort of sits back and observes and is not even in this work from day to day, that Donald Trump has a curious relationship with elections. Let me just try this out on you as a theory and see if you agree. Because I detect a bit of a pattern these days. And the pattern is that when he wins an election, it's fair and good and a mandate. And when he loses an election, it's rigged and awful, and we have to change our entire system. It's like we have an 8-year-old running our country. And I don't think that we can any longer sit back and listen to his rantings and increasing incoherence and act like it doesn't have consequences to our electoral process in the fall. We see, for example, the signs of this in the way in which it's inculcating a number of different things different activities from the administration, in very clear ways. A few weeks ago at a political event, the now acting Attorney General of the United States expressed surprise that anybody would ever object at ICE agents being posted at polls. The chief legal officer in the country believes that having masked thugs at our polling places is something we should all welcome. We've seen the president adopt not one, not two, but 3 executive orders that purport to have a power and authority for the president to determine how we vote, when the Constitution is clear that that power lies with state and local government. The first 2, clearly have been struck down. The third one will be as well. We have seen the president also put all of his legislative energy not into making things better for the American people, not in terms of trying to address a crisis in terms of affordability, much of which he has created and exacerbated, but instead is demanding that Congress, before they do anything else, pass the SAVE Act. And, among other things, we know that this is an act which will have a profound impact in terms of access to the ballot box across the country if it is adopted. We know, for example, just in the state of Illinois, that 5 million people do not have access to a passport. And if they did need that access to a passport in order to register under the provisions of the SAVE Act, they would be forced to spend money, a significant amount of money, in order to gain access to that passport. I am old, but I'm old enough to remember when we thought poll taxes were a bad thing in this country. But the president speaks with pride about enforcing one on people all across the country. The other alternative, obviously, for people under the SAVE Act would be to get a copy of their original birth certificate. You know, I always think about the fact, as you know, Illinois was one of the last states to adopt the Real ID provision regulations and to begin issuing Real ID. And, you know, we fought that for a number of years throughout the early 2000s. And I will never forget, you know, I think one of the things that was really important in that battle was that our then Secretary of State, Jesse White, literally did not have a birth certificate. He was born at home. And so he did not have a birth certificate. And you know, he would always say to legislators and in public and to others, how would I ever get one of these? How would that work? And so, you know, one of the keys to that was you had a public official who saw the real harm that came from that. And so, you know, that is one of the things that I think about the president pushing this SAVE Act, you know, that I think we need to continue to do is, and I'll talk about this in a moment, is really sort of push back against messages about this. But there's another thing about this is that these are not just folks like us screaming or, Lord knows, you know, having, as he loves to call it, Trump derangement syndrome. We know how this works. Kansas, a few years ago, adopted a law similar to the SAVE Act in that state. In the months that it was enacted before a federal court struck it down, it was estimated that 1/3 of the people in Kansas who tried to register to vote were denied should have been eligible to cast a ballot. And so we see that there is proof of harm. We know there is cost to people, and we know that it will suppress votes. And yet the president and his party continue to push this measure as being something that we, you know, that we should have. And, you know, finally, what we see is, you know, these efforts on the part of the administration, which is also built into the SAVE Act, to get all of our personal information, right, through voting information, to get, and I'm happy to say that a federal court in Massachusetts recently struck that measure down. We expect that a federal court in Illinois will also dismiss the administration's lawsuit seeking that data from every Illinois voter. But it is the kind of thing where for them, this idea, this notion of building a national database that they will claim is the official list of who should be allowed to vote and who shouldn't be, and then using those to try to question elections and create litigation and questions about the integrity are a part of the scheme that we're seeing running up to the November elections. And of course, lastly, and you know, we know that the president and some of his supporters have circulated a new draft executive order, which claims that it was China who, involved themselves in the 2020 election in the United States. And as a result of that, gives the president this executive authority to simply federalize elections. And in one version of that draft that is circulating, the White House would call on every single voter across the country to have to re-register prior to the November elections and re-register using the requirements of the SAVE Act. You know, this is fanciful stuff. This is not anything that bears any close resemblance to facts on the ground. I heard the Vice President of the United States say this week it was Ukraine who meddled, but he was in Hungary, so maybe that was why. But the reality is that these are the kinds of plans that they're making. And so we need to be prepared. So what do? From the ACLU's perspective, let me say, I think there's a number of things that we've done and we are doing to prepare for this onslaught. And it begins first with continuing to give people information about what their rights are in voting in Illinois, and to continue in every way that we can to protect the advancements that we have made in Illinois to give people access to the ballot and to make it easy for people to register, to make it easier for people to vote, and to make it easy for people to have their vote counted. And we're going to continue to do that work everywhere that we can in terms of talking and discussing these issues with people. But the second thing is, of course, and it's the value of an organization like the ACLU is that we're also going to go to court. As I mentioned, we have challenged the collection of the voter data. We will challenge this. We've challenged this new executive order on mail-in ballots. We challenged the previous executive orders. If he tries the crazy pants China executive order, we will challenge that one. We will challenge wherever he is. But I want to talk for a minute about this issue of ICE at the polls, because I think that's a place where, we need to all be prepared. The governor of Illinois earlier this week said that he believes he will do it. I think the governor is right, because I think an increasingly desperate and unpopular narcissist will see this as his way out of a corner. And, one of the things is there are both federal and state laws that bar armed agents from being proximate to voting places. And clearly there is no reason for those agents to be there. So we are working with our friends at the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights Under Law, the MacArthur Justice Center, and others. We are preparing to be able to go to court to challenge the deployment of those agents in polls in Illinois. I don't know today if we will file that challenge before the election as a prohibitive matter, or if it will be something we'll have to do in terms of responding to it. But I will tell you that we will be ready. And I ask all of you two things. First of all, since you represent communities from across the state, we'll need litigants and we'll need clients when that moment comes. And the league will be very important, Becky, where that's concerned. But the second thing is that we need you all in your communities to be on the lookout and be cautious for what you're hearing. Again, we've been talking to a variety of different people, certainly state elected officials, but I think it's important for all of us to be monitoring these situations and be prepared and be ready. Because I think it's going to be a place where we're going to have to take quick action, and we're going to have to be determined in the way that we approach this. And I think that's going to be one of our challenges. But beyond taking those actions and beyond just doing simple know your rights information, I think there's one other thing I want to raise with you all this morning that I think we should be thinking about collectively. And that is that, we need to fight back against this growing chorus of people in media, in social media, and on the right wing who claim that our elections are rigged. For too long, I think that for many of us, we've looked at that, and whether it was Donald Trump or Rudy Giuliani, or here's a name for you from the distant past, Bob Dornan. Anybody remember Bob Dornan from California? Was a member of Congress. They called him Bombardier Bob Dornan. And he won elections for several years and everything was fine. And then he lost, and all of a sudden, every election was rigged. And I think about that because one of the things is I think we have often mocked and dismissed that talk. It is time to confront it. It is time to make clear that there is not widespread fraud in our election system. It is time to make clear that when there are inadequacies, when there are inconsistencies, when there is some sort of abuse in our system, that abuse is identified and it is punished. We have for far too long simply given the microphone and the field to crazy people. Who literally have no idea what they're talking about and no facts to back it up once they do. We should demand when they make these claims that they provide specific examples. And, you know, I say this as a comms director, if our friends in the media won't do that, we ought to demand of the media that they do that as well. You know, we ought to note, for example, that when Republican politicians all across this country talk about the SAVE Act and say, well, it's just voter ID, it is not. And we ought to demand that they actually specifically describe what's in their bill, comma, if they know what's in their bill. And one thing I think we really need to do is to push back on this notion, which gets repeated in circles, that the American public and that voters widely support voter ID. Because there's two things about that. First of all, I've seen the polling, and that support that they claim of 80% or 78% or 75% falls dramatically when you point out that there is up to 10 to 12 to 15% of the American public that does not have a government issued ID. You know, we should never forget that when the voter ID question went to the Supreme Court of the United States, that in writing his majority opinion in that case, Antonin Scalia said, well, yeah, it really will suppress some voters, but I guess that's just the price we pay. We ought to make people answer for that price. And we should not sit back and cower and act like, well, let's not do the SAVE Act, but maybe we'll do some voter ID and just suppress some votes. We ought to suppress no votes. And finally, I think that we need a vision again on what it means to participate in the electoral system in this country. You know, elections have consequences. We've all heard that, and goodness knows we are living through it. And one of the elements of this, I think, that is really critical is to recognize and to make stark for people the choices that we are facing in this elections and one going forward. I don't usually like to do this, but I'm going to. I'm going to quote J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance gave a speech a few months ago at the Claremont Institute. I'm obsessed with this speech. I really would urge you to go find it and read the entire thing. J.D. Vance in that speech said something along the lines of this. He said this. Let me just stop with the caveats. He said that you are more of an American if you have been here for several successive generations, even if your family fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War, than if you have come here more recently and you adhere to all of the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The experiment is over for them. They have theirs, and they're done trying. the kind of inclusive, new, muscular democracy that protects immigrants and women and reproductive rights and voting rights and privacy and all of the things that we want to protect, they don't want that. I do. And the way for us to get there is twofold in terms of listening to John Lewis. It is, number one, to protect the right to vote and assure that everybody has that opportunity, because I am convinced, as Representative Lewis was, that if we have a fair debate and we have a fair vote and we have a fair discussion, that our side will always win. And the other thing is that we need to keep being out in the streets and demanding this. We need to quote Becky, we need to act. Now is not the time for timidity. Now is not the time for reservation. Now is the time for courageous action, because we are not fighting for this moment. We are literally in a battle for the future of our country. I shared with somebody, I think Kelly, before I started today, that a month after Donald Trump was elected, my wife and I became grandparents for the first time. She is perfect, in case you wondered, and I do have photos. But you know, it's funny, she has kept me sane in this year plus of this work. But the other thing she does is give me inspiration every morning to get up and fight again. Because I'm not fighting for me. I'm not fighting for my parents or the vision they had for America. I'm fighting for the kind of country that she'll grow up in. And that's a fight I am so happy to be in with you. And thank you all very much. Do you have time for some questions? Do you have time for questions or you? No? Okay. Okay. You're saying no.
Do we have any questions? We have 5 minutes for questions. The microphone is right next to you. Just make sure it's turned on. Can you move over here because of the camera?
Yeah.
It's on the.
I really am not a Luddite. Can you speak just briefly to the misinformation about the number of non-citizens who have quote unquote registered? My sense is when the Cato Institute comes out and says,
Yeah.
not a problem.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
not a problem.
Well, not only the Cato Institute, but the Heritage Foundation, the home of Project 2025,
And
says
many
that,
secretaries of state.
yeah,
Who've done
say
the
that
same
that
work.
doesn't exist. And I think that's one of that, and thank you for raising this question, because I think that's the thing, is I think we need to have like a single talking point about that Heritage Foundation study that we cite every time somebody says that. And every time somebody does it in a newspaper article, we need to write a letter to the editor. And every time we get a chance to go to a city council meeting and raise that point, we need to do that, or a county board or somewhere else. Because I think that's one of those that, to use an old phrase, you shouldn't be able to turn around without seeing or hearing that point get made.
And does the league have that? Does the league have that talking point that we can use in our communications to our?
Good question. I don't know. We'll look it up. If we don't, we'll get one.
Thanks. We can borrow it from the ACLU if necessary. Thank
We
you.
have one more question, and that's all the time that we have.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. And I apologize for going back. Thoughts, but two questions. One,
Hold on.
because. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just can't see. Oh, there. Okay, thank you. Okay. As I said earlier, thank you for being here and for your presentation today and giving us direction. And I apologize because you ended on such a hopeful note to go back to kind of a dark thought. What do you think about the possibility that elections could be canceled? And secondly, what about martial law and the possibility of that being declared, and how would that impact elections?
Okay. I am not afraid of elections being canceled because he doesn't have the power to do it. And so I think the only people who would listen to some call from the White House for elections being canceled are people from his side. I don't think that's a place that they want to go to. With martial law, you know, there isn't a particular quote martial law, provision in federal law. They would have to they would have to invoke the Insurrection Act or do something of that nature. That's another place where, as we saw with the National Guard, is number one, what the Supreme Court has made clear is he has to define why they're needed and be able to demonstrate that. And I don't think that it's going to be possible for the federal government to do that. So I think that the idea of canceling or somehow, the federalizing the elections are not really the possible thing. The scenarios I worry about are either A, suppressing votes through a series of confusing statements and et cetera. And I think that's why, empowering people with their rights early on is so important. And I think the second thing I'm concerned about is what we're going to see post-election, which is going to be a lot of messy litigation, a lot of claims of people not having been elected appropriately, and an effort not to seat the Congress that's actually elected. And, that is the challenge, I think, that, that's the part that's going to be really up to lawyers and courts, and really in many ways for our courts to decide whether or not they're going to let these wild claims go on. If people are going to say, as they did after 2020, well, the president's just having a temper tantrum, what's the harm? Well, it turns out when he then sends a mob to the U.S. House, maybe there is a cost. And so I think that's the question about that issue, but I don't worry about elections being canceled.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.